haven't got anything else to do, you better do it now because this is not going to be very hot.
And finally, it all comes down to this.
Here we are at the big moment.
Now we come to the moment of truth, the best picture of the year.
Take one. Hi, my name is Sam, and I watch movies. Well, I made it back for a second go-around. I found making the first video a rewarding way to collate my thoughts and a nice creative outlet, so here we are again. Second video, second ceremony. The second Academy Awards were held on April 3rd, 1930, honoring movies made between August 1st, 1928 and July 31st, 1929. Like many second attempts, a lot of changes were made to the format, some better, some worse, and some in retrospect that are fairly confusing. In the better category, they didn't announce winners 3 months beforehand. This presumably led to actual suspense, and therefore more interest in the ceremony, as well as probably some more hurt feelings on that night. Confusingly, though, there was no official list of nominees. In fact, the nominees that I watched for this are from an unofficial list that the Academy put together after the fact based on the films that were evaluated by judges at the time. The ceremony was broadcast live on local radio station KNX. For the only time in Academy history, no movie wins more than one award. All awards were won by sound films, though no particular distinction was made at the time between sound and silent movies in the judges' considerations. Also of note is Mary Pickford, the eventual winner of Best Actress, lobbying judges by inviting them around to her house to have tea while she attempted to persuade them to consider her for the award. The Academy would never recover from the introduction of politics. In addition, they also reduced the number of categories from 12 down to 7. Most notably for my purposes, there's now only one Best Picture category called Outstanding Picture. But they also removed any distinction between adapted writing and original writing for their Best Writing Award, as well as having only one Best Director category. Actors and actresses were now being nominated for individual roles instead of an annual body of work, and a couple of awards were just outright removed. No honorary awards were given. In general, I find these changes interesting historical notes, and this ceremony feels like the first steps towards what we think of when we now talk about the Oscars. They would continue to fiddle with the categories, but having a single Best Picture has a powerful definitiveness that the previous separation lacked, and I think that's why they've never gone back to having an artistic category. I don't think we'd be talking about the Oscars now if they didn't make the event into an actual award ceremony rather than a sort of dinner banquet. And the introduction of politicking for awards, for better or worse, is now, to my mind, a core part of the Oscars and who wins and who loses. So, while they made all these changes for the second Academy Awards, how did the actual movies being awarded stack up this year? Well, let's start with Alibi. Alibi is a 1929 crime melodrama starring Chester Morris, Harry Stubbs, Mae Bush, and Eleanor Griffiths. It was directed by Roland West. So this was a painful one. It can probably be chalked up to being such an early sound film and the difficulties of the technology at the time, but even then, this feels like a massive step back in so many ways that after watching it, I was legitimately worried about the other movies I would have to watch for this year. The movie starts strong with a intro of stark, evocative sounds over the title credits that really conjure a mean, brutal mood, and a mood that is actually pretty fitting for how vicious this movie does get at certain points. So normally I jump in with a plot synopsis here, but before I do, I just want to note that about 20 minutes into watching the movie, I had to look at the Wikipedia plot summary to figure out what the hell was going on and what this movie was even about. That can be attributed to both the roughness of the sound itself, which I can't really hold against the movie too much, given that it was such a new technology at the time, and I don't know that it's been restored recently. But also the painfully glacial and boring camera framing. The sound's not great, but it's intelligible, and that's about the most I can say for this time period. But the editing and the shot framing are real failure points, and they did surprise me. Those are the two things that I would expect to carry over from silent filmmaking, and instead this movie is full of dull, wide shots that just seem to go on forever. Between that and the way the sound is often captured, it just feels like watching people deliver lines on a soundstage. And I mean, it doesn't feel like a final performance, it feels like a rehearsal, not even a dress rehearsal.
I heard what you said, Dad, and I can prove that you can't stand Chick for that.
Now you keep out of this.
In honesty, it was to the point where in the middle of the movie, I legitimately thought that shot reverse shot, a foundational film technique, might have been invented after sound instead of before. I looked it up afterwards. No, it existed. Anyways, as for the plot of the movie, we follow Joan.
Well, I've had enough of being a policeman's daughter, and I don't want to be another policeman's wife.
The daughter of a police sergeant who doesn't want to marry a cop and instead secretly marries Chick Williams, who is a gang leader that's convinced her he's on the straight and narrow. When Chick's gang kills a cop during a robbery gone wrong, he needs, well, an alibi. I will say the setup is different, and it does feel like a proto-noir with how dark it can get with the material. There are two scenes that I would personally classify as light to moderate torture.
No, Tommy, it's murder! It's murder!
Why did you kill O'Brien?
I didn't.
Who did?
I don't know.
Who killed O'Brien?
I don't know.
Who killed O'Brien?
I don't know.
Who killed O'Brien?
I don't know, I tell you.
Who killed O'Brien? Who killed O'Brien? Who killed O'Brien?
Just me for squealing.
And we'll get you out there down.
Both perpetuated by cops.
Open the door! Open the door! Is he gonna kill me? Open it! Don't stop me!
No, you don't. There's only one way out.
Cops, I will note, are naturally not well liked by the gang, but even Joan has a little ACAB energy that is an interesting wrinkle for the time.
Well, we've got to uphold the law.
Law? Is third-degreeing, bulldozing people into confessing crimes they didn't commit? Is that law?
Just me
for squealing.
And we'll get you out there down.
No, but, I don't understand now.
Of course you don't. You're a policeman.
Somebody's widowed by the end of it, and it just generally lacks the sweet sentimentality that was in so many of the previous year's movies. Insofar as I was rooting for anyone in this picture, Chick, played by Chester Morris, is probably the most charismatic and interesting actor. He's genuinely kind of threatening, and he has a smarmy greasiness that's pretty perfect for the role. He was nominated for Best Actor, and that doesn't surprise me. It makes a lot of sense. Outside of that, though, I was really surprised at how amateurish and off this whole thing felt. I can only assume that expectations at the time were dramatically different, and the newness of sound really swept people up, so the dry, static shots and the languid editing weren't such an issue for audiences at the time. I really thought the previous year's Chang would be the most I would struggle watching a movie for a while, but as it turns out, I was right back in it with Alibi. 1 out of 5. After Alibi, I legitimately didn't know how I should temper my expectations for this group of movies. I mean, did everybody forget how to make movies when sound came around? Were the limitations that severe? Should I just expect middle school theater club quality for the rest of this year's nominees? As it turns out, no. People still did remember how to make movies that were not a slog to sit through, and thankfully, Alibi was the worst of the bunch. In Old Arizona is a 1929 Western starring Warner Baxter, Edmund Lowe, and Dorothy Burgess. It was directed by Raoul Walsh. This is our first Western, and I do feel obligated to say up front that the Old West as it actually was and the Old West as it was portrayed by Hollywood are two very different things. And these movies can be rough to watch. on top of just the general insensitivity of things like brownface and ugly racial stereotyping and tropes, the overall portrayal of the era is a near total whitewash. The cowboy was not a glamorous job to have, and it was often left to minorities and immigrants and the poorest of society to take on. I know I'm going to run into a lot of gross relics in this project, but the myths that the American Western movies created do hang around to this day, and I think the motivated manipulation of that history is always worth mentioning when they come up. With all that said, In Old Arizona is a big improvement on Alibi from a filmmaking perspective. This is the first sound film shot outside, and the canyons and deserts of Utah and California help give it a bit of visual flair. The directing is competent and considered overall, and the movie mostly feels like what I think of as old movies. It's slower and less dynamic and leans towards longer shots, but they're usually constructed well enough that you don't necessarily get bored just looking at it. Instead, this movie's problems are all in the characters and the plot. In short, everybody here sucks. This movie follows three characters: the Cisco Kid, a Robin-esque gentleman bandit who never steals from the individual.
I never rob the individual.
And is a generally charming, roguish type. He is also a white guy in brownface doing a really bad accent.
Oh, I like lots of senoritas, but I love only one.
There's his girlfriend, Tonya Maria, who is an unfortunately shallow Mexican girl who turns out to be motivated solely by greed and vanity. She is also a white woman in brownface doing a really bad accent.
Where's your camp? Spotted some here?
Trying to capture the Cisco Kid, there's Sergeant Mickey Dunn, white guy. I think he's supposed to be charming, but all of his jokes suck.
No more costuma.
Costuma? What do I look like, a dressmaker?
And he comes across as a total pig.
I gotta give you credit, son. You sure can sing them.
Love and duty. For once they go together.
So there's just no one here really to get behind. Through most of the movie, I would say I was rooting for the Cisco Kid. Warner Baxter won Best Actor for the role, and horrific accent aside, he fits pretty well into the endearing scoundrel type. That is, up until the moment he sets up Tonya Maria to get killed for betraying him for another man. It's really cold-blooded and it sucks.
Her flirting days are over.
The movie tends to lean towards comedy, and all of it's dated. Mickey's whole routine is like if Groucho Marx lost all of his wit and channeled the worst parts of John Wayne.
I love only one. Same with me. One at a time. It's only fair to the second. Know what I mean?
The only good jokes are the ones with a classic sort of setup, like this long routine where Cisco plays around talking to people who don't know he's the bandit that they're looking for.
But if I ever meet him face to face, I'll kill him like I would a dog.
What? You know a fellow they call the Cisco Kid?
Hey, that was him you just shook hands with over there.
What?
The plot itself really just comes down to shitty people betraying each other, and not in a compelling Succession kind of way. I haven't seen Succession, but I get the vibe that betrayal happens and it's interesting. As much as I was on board with In Old Arizona early, it really just makes you listen to so much of this dude's crappy routine, and the characters all become so hateable by the end that I was honestly just happy to have the whole thing over with. At least I wasn't bored. 2 out of 5.
What?
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 The Patriot is a 1928 biographical drama starring Emil Jannings, Florence Vitor, and Louis Stone. It was directed by Ernst Lubitsch. I didn't watch The Patriot. I can't watch The Patriot. It's a film that is quite literally lost to time. Film history is full of lost movies that just weren't preserved well or forgotten about or stored poorly, but The Patriot is the only Best Picture nominee to suffer this fate. Parts of it do exist, including the trailer that I'm cutting up here to use as an overlay, but it is sadly incomplete. Hans Crawley won Best Writing for the screenplay, which I was considering reading instead, but to me that felt insufficient. A movie is not just its screenplay. Lewis Stone was nominated for Best Actor in this, and that is a performance that we will just never see in its entirety. Really, I just don't think there's a substitute for what's been lost. It's a stark reminder of the value of preservation. These were physical objects that existed in the real world. Film is a material, and left to rot, what's on it will disappear. There is someone out there who was the last person to see the Patriot, and I bet they had no idea. No rating. Maybe it gets found in some forgotten vault someday, but until then, we can only guess and surmise. The Hollywood Revue of 1929 is a musical comedy variety picture directed by Charles Reisner and featuring nearly all of MGM's stars at the time. This is certainly a weird one to talk about compared to probably all the other movies that I'm going to talk about for this project. The Hollywood Revue of 1929 is a revue. It's more of a stage variety show put to film than what we would traditionally consider a movie. It's a series of musical numbers and comedy sketches that was meant at the time to show off both the newfangled sound technology and MGM's own stable of stars.
Your face is familiar to me. Didn't I meet you in Omaha?
There are a number of notable folks that show up here. The names that I knew beforehand were Joan Crawford, Jack Benny, Buster Keaton, and Laurel and Hardy. These variety-style movies weren't uncommon at the time, and I believe each major studio took at least one shot at making this kind of thing, as sound became a major game changer in the industry. After all, they've been making silent movies for forever, and they probably needed to know who could make the transition and who they would let out of their contract.
Ah, Queenie. Hey, weren't we out together in Schenectady one night?
This movie was a big hit at the time, and I think I can see why. A movie like this allowed audiences all over the country to see the type of show that one could only really see in a major city. And you certainly wouldn't get this number of stars even then. In my mind, it does a pretty good job of emulating a theater experience, which is really mostly what it's going for. As for watching it now, I don't think it's something I would recommend necessarily. I enjoyed it for what it was, and I think if adding sound to your movie is going to severely limit what you can do with the camera, filming a stage show makes a lot of sense. It's a good way to taper expectations on that front. There are a couple of creative moments with special effects trickery that are pretty cool for the time and lend it a bit of a unique flavor rather than just being a pure stage show. The comedy is goofy and old-timey, but for the most part it's the sweet kind of humor that even if you're not actually laughing, it still feels nice to watch and it can draw out a smile or two.
Now listen, boyfriend. You have a nice line of chatter, but how do I know you care for me in a big way?
Julie, baby, I'm gaga about you.
A few bits did genuinely get me to laugh.
The little number you just heard called Singing in the Rain is an optimistic song and was, of course, written by an optimist. In fact, all of the lyrics, like There's a Rainbow Round My Shoulder and Let a Smile Be Your Umbrella and so forth, were all written by the same man who finally became so discouraged that he killed himself.
But they're not worth the full 2-hour sit-through. To get to, it really does drag at certain points, and your mileage will vary from skit to skit. Finding a way to watch this was pretty difficult. The version I found was cut off and framed awkwardly at times. This might just be what the most current version looks like, I don't know. This Amazon review explains in extensive and fascinating detail the aspect ratio being off on the DVD release, so thanks for that, Bruce. This is a weird thing to have been nominated for Best Picture, but the more that I think about it, the more I'm glad that it was. It doesn't have a lot of historical value, and it's not an artistic work in the way that a Best Picture probably should be, but its existence in this list is indicative that film exists in many forms and many types, and it's worth keeping that definition expansive rather than narrow. 2.5 out of 5. The Broadway Melody is a 1929 musical directed by Harry Beaumont and starring Charles King, Anita Page, and Bessie Love. And so we finally arrive at the winner of Outstanding Picture for the second Academy Awards, The Broadway Melody. Generally considered the first complete sound musical, it is an impressive technological step up from the other sound movies that I watched for them.
All out of style, but Broadway, always there to smile.
And I'm glad I watched all the other nominees, because without the context they provide, I probably would have just considered this a pretty rote melodrama that's typical of the era. In context, though, it's a strong step up. It may or may not be attributable to how recently and thoroughly they've received restoration efforts, but in comparison to the others, the Broadway Melody sounds superb and generally feels like a movie that understands what sound can bring.
Are you back again?
Yes, and I'm telling you how I want my music played.
I've conducted opera. What do you know about music?
Nothing. I only wrote it, that's all.
Then you have the best of me. You don't have to listen to it.
Apparently a lot of work went into figuring out how to capture and utilize sound best for this, and it really does pay off.
Hey, are you trying to crab our act?
No, I'm not trying to crab your act.
Actors are intelligible, and there's a relative dearth of awkward silences, and some scenes are even cut with background music.
Did you hear that, Mr. Sandfield? They're trying to drown me out.
Are you trying to drown him out?
We're doing our best.
This was the highest grossing movie of 1929, and I can only imagine what audiences thought of the novelty of an all-sound musical. It reminds me a bit of James Cameron's Avatar, where a pretty pedestrian story was overlooked for an impressive technological leap forward.
Hey, put that spotlight over here on this girl.
What's it over there?
Well, it goes over here. That spotlight goes here.
The Broadway Melody is about two sisters, Queenie and Hank, who move to the Big Apple and try to make it big.
Baby, they were plenty smart when they made you beautiful.
They are helped along by Hank's beau, Eddie, a songwriter who gets them a gig in a Broadway Revue that he's a part of.
Hank, did you pack my new dress in the trunk?
I'll get it for you in a minute.
The primary conflict, though, is a sort of secret love triangle. Hank and Eddie are together, but Eddie loves Queenie immediately on seeing her because I guess she's hotter and he's a moron. Queenie doesn't want to admit that she reciprocates those feelings, so instead she starts going out with a rich financier of the theater named Jock Warner, who also notices her because she's hot. Eddie and Hank want her to stop seeing this guy as they see he just wants her for her looks, and she gets more and more drawn into the glamour and ritziness of show business and rich assholes. The emotional fallout between Hank, who is left behind as the ugly one, I guess, and Queenie is probably the most effective stuff here. Anita Page isn't great as Queenie, but Bessie Love, who plays Hank, is pretty effective, and she was nominated for Best Actress, I think rightly so. Anyway, Hank eventually finds out about the emotional affair between Queenie and Eddie, and basically sacrifices her own happiness for the sake of her sister. It's soap opera stuff, but it largely worked for me.
What do you think I've been meaning all along? I was on the level with this thing, that I was in love with you. That's a hot one. Say I just been playing you for all I could get out of you for the act.
You mean to say you've been kidding me all the time?
Sure, I've been kidding you. Say I wouldn't marry you if you was the last man on earth.
The dialogue had a lot of zingers that got small chuckles.
What are you trying to do, ruin my profile? Your profile was ruined the day you were born.
And overall it felt snappy enough to keep me entertained when it was light, and the drama wasn't drawn out or awful enough for me to really lose what investment I had. One other notable aspect of this movie is that it contains a Technicolor sequence. The sequence has been sadly lost to time, and all we have now is a black and white version, but it did start an association of musical films and colored film. Modern reviews are pretty harsh on this movie, and that does make sense to me. It does have some pretty bad acting at times, and the directing and editing is mostly just adequate by any modern standards. But if the other nominees are any indication, adequate is more than good enough for this era. New technology can often mean innovations happen fast, and these 4 movies all came out within a year, but there is a massive gap between the best and the worst.
Sweetie, why don't you look at my feet? Look at that.
I can see somebody watching Alibi at the time and thinking that sound was just a fad, but you'd be hard-pressed to assume that after watching the Broadway Melody. Maybe I'm being more generous to this than I should be, but this is easily the most watchable movie of the bunch, and easily my favorite, and to my mind, it's a worthy winner for Most Outstanding Picture of the 2nd Academy Awards. Congratulations to the Broadway Melody. 2.5 out of 5.
Okay, cut!
The 2nd Academy Awards were, well, a mixed bag. This year didn't have any movie in it that I knew beforehand, and so I wasn't sure what to expect. I could have just watched one movie, given that there were no official nominees, and I honestly might have been better off just doing that. I think it's fairly obvious why these are all mostly forgotten. It was a weak group overall. Here is my ranking of what I watched. Broadway Melody was certainly the best of the bunch, but in large part it was just by default. In Old Arizona is painfully dated.
What?
The Hollywood Revue isn't bad, but it's like picking the best apple out of a bunch of oranges. And Alibi is genuinely shocking in how unprofessional it feels.
Certainly I'll do it.
After all of them, I'm genuinely sad about The Patriot being lost to time because that may well have been the best of them. It's the last silent movie that would be nominated for 91 years, meaning I don't get to watch Charlie Chaplin's best works, and this was certainly an era where silent movies were still going strong artistically. In all, I'm curious as to how long this will be the worst bunch of movies that I watch. It was a big step down from the previous year, which had some truly excellent movies, but also just a generally higher median of quality. Looking forward, I'm hopeful they get a grip on how to use sound and integrate it quickly, and that this remains a low point for a long time. Seeing the dramatic shift that sound introduced to the form has been fascinating, but man, I can see so much more now why this was a contentious technology for some at the time. As we approach a new decade and a new era of both sound and world events, I'm excited to see how things change and what sensibilities come to the forefront in the next round of Best Pictures. Until next time, I'm Sam. Thanks for watching.